Thank you. My name is Brady Gartman. This is my colleague, Erika Haguette. We just finished our master's degrees at New York University in the economics department, where we conducted this research with the help of Professor Storchman. So Erika is going to begin.
Okay, so, that sounds expensive. Okay, so this research started because we were basically just trying to figure out, like, okay, climate change, temperatures are going up, how's that going to impact prices? And once we started looking into that, it kind of snowballed into what you guys are going to see today. So this kind of sums up our motivation in terms of like how we arrived at what we're going to talk about. And it was basically when we started looking at how these prices have been varying from year to year and how the temperatures have been varying from year to year, we noticed that not only has it been a variance in wholesale prices and on retail prices, but also there's a variance in the difference between the two. So the markup that the retailers are charging on top of that wholesale price. And so we know that temperatures do affect the prices of these wines. So we wanted to maybe pose the question of whether weather is going to actually explain the variance, not only in the prices, but also in the margins that the retailers are charging on top of the wholesale price. And if so, are the retail margins going to be higher for wines from better years? You would assume it's maybe more profitable to sell better wine. And so eventually what we wanted to try to answer is, are the wine retailers going to benefit from the rise in temperatures that the world is seeing? And so when we start talking about the effects of temperature on prices, that's fairly intuitive. Price is going to be a function of the quantity and the quality of these wines, and both are functions of the temperature, among other things. And if you look at previous literature, and we ran some regressions to also try to confirm some of this, but for the Bordeaux high-end wines, which is what we're looking at in our data set, we assume a positive temperature impact on both the quantity and the quality. They tend to thrive in hotter, drier years. And so what ends up happening here is that because the quantity and the price are negatively related, we can't clearly state whether the temperature is going to have a positive or a negative impact on the prices at first. But if we break down that relationship and we think about the growing season temperatures and how they affect the prices, we can think about just the effects that they have in general. So it'll affect your marginal cost because those, since they thrive in the hotter temperatures, then there's going to be higher yields. With higher yields, you have lower marginal costs as you keep producing more. And then the higher temperatures are also going to affect the quality of these wines, making them better. And so there's going to be an effect on the demand. So when we think about our market, we are going to assume that the quality effect is going to prevail because these are very high-end wines. We would expect that higher temperatures, which we kind of refer to as good years for these wines, they're going to have a positive effect, and it's going to lead to higher retail and wholesale prices for these wines. And so once we figure out that price, we have to figure out how they go from the price to their retail markup. And that was the part that I thought was most interesting, is that we started to learn about how the New York State market works for these wines and how it passes down from, the chateau down to the retailer. And it's actually quite interesting, and it works like this, or in a way similar to this for most US states. And they follow this three-tier system where the wine is produced and then it gets imported and goes to this wholesaler, and then from the wholesaler to the retailer. But the interesting things about this is that for New York State, for example, there's only one wholesaler per each of these wines, so they end up being a monopolist. And the wholesale prices are set, so that's how we got our data. So at a specific point in time, these wholesalers go to the New York State Liquor Authority and they say, hey, this is the price that we're going to charge. So the prices are set. Every single store is going to buy this wine at wholesale for the exact same price. It's actually illegal for them to purchase these wines from wholesalers from different states. So we know that these retailers are going to be purchasing from these licensed wholesalers at this set price in the state of New York. And on top of that, a person or a business can only own one wine and liquor store in the entire state. So that limits their market power because I can't have 100 stores, I can only have one. And so this leads to this problem known as double marginalization that basically let's assume that there's like a string of at least a couple of monopolists here. You have to go from the producer to the importer, wholesaler to the retail. If you are, for example, the wholesaler, you're not going to worry about who is down the supply chain. So you're going to just price at whatever is going to maximize your own profit. And that's going to put you at a suboptimal point where you're charging higher and you're not really worried for anyone else that's down that line. So when we started looking into this and the structure and how that's going to affect the pricing and the quantity that ends up being sold in this market, we kind of realized that this might hint at maybe the retailers aren't doing so hot when it comes to like these really good years because of these double marginalization problems. And so when the wine passes down to their hands, most of the profit maybe already got eaten, or that's kind of what we started to wonder, and that's what our data basically explores. And so what our data consists of is prices of these Bordeaux's, the higher end Bordeaux. So these are, I think there are 5 tiers of Bordeaux's, and we did the top 2 tiers, and these are all the chateaux that we included. It's all of the tier 1s and then most of the tier 2s. And this was fall 2018. We scraped a wine searcher for the prices at the retail level. And so we have all of the retail stores in New York State and how much they sold it for at that point in time. So it ranges wines from 1982 to 2015, but the price is from September of 2018. And then the wholesale prices, like I mentioned before, they're posted by the New York State Liquor Authority. There's only one wholesaler per wine, so there's only one wholesale price per each of these wines. And then the weather data is just temperature and precipitation from the Bordeaux region. And Brady's going to talk a little bit more about what we did with the data.
Thank you. Okay, so after we scrape that data off of Wine Searcher, we would have an observation, and that observation would have a single wholesale price for a single vintage of a particular chateau. And it may be retailed at a single retailer, or it may be retailed at 30 retailers across New York. All across the board, we ended up with 730 observations that were satisfactory for analysis, where we had retail price, wholesale price, Parker score, markup, which is calculated as retail price over wholesale price, so that's a number greater than 1 normally, age, which is just calculated from the vintage, and then the precipitation and temperature observed every day at the single weather station within the growing region. Then we aggregate across the growing season, August and September for precipitation, and April through September for temperature. And with that data, we begin to do a traditional econometric analysis, the first of which considers the wholesale price and the retail price against those variables. So this is back to the question, is price influenced by temperature? Is there a relationship between the wholesale and the retail price respectively for temperature? And we find definitely there is a significant relationship here. Warmer years lead to higher prices. Drier years lead to higher prices. This is consistent with the literature, and it validates our data set. And we can see you can actually, once you control for all the things that we include, you have a pretty good explanatory power of the prices here. These are well-known wines, and the market is well understood. A thought you might have is, well, shouldn't quality matter? A common measure of quality would be the Parker score, certainly not the only one. So when we regress against Parker score against the prices, wholesale and retail, we find that there's no significant relationship. So we exclude Parker score from the rest of our analysis. There's nothing interesting to be found there for this data set. The temperatures tell us much more interesting story. So this is a little bit overwhelming at first, but it's a quantile regression where we move across the price quantiles for the 2 variables we're interested in. In gray we have the wholesale price, and in the red we have the retail price. And you can see that the effect of temperature on price decreases as we get higher in price. And this is where we first start to see an interesting story. It particularly decreases dramatically at the highest end of price. So for the most expensive wines, we see that they are much less sensitive to changes in temperature. There seems to be less movement there when the years are better because the temperature is higher. Now we can get to the real question of interest, which is how does the markup respond? The price changes may be intuitive, but the markup, at least not to me, it's not obvious how that would move. And we find that both log of markup and markup itself have negative coefficients on temperature. That is, wines from better years, i.e. hotter years, actually have a lower markup at retail. That is, the retailer is appropriating fewer of the benefits of those higher prices for warmer years. Why is this the case? Well, consider back to what Erika was explaining about the structure of the supply chain in the New York State wine market. The monopolist upstream, and we know there's at least one monopolist because the wholesaler has the exclusive right to not only sell the wine and be the only person selling that wine in New York State, but to entirely dictate the price of that wine. And we know what it is because they publish it in a book and they say this is the only price we're going to charge to anyone who buys this wine this year. Or this month, it's published monthly. So we find a statistically significant negative coefficient on retail markup. Now, maybe that changes just like the price did as we move across the quantile of markup. And we find it certainly does. When you look at the markup quantiles against temperature, you have increasingly larger negative magnitude impact of temperature on markup. Put another way, hotter years are particularly detrimental to retail markups for the most expensive wines. So the farther you move into the most premier wines in the world, these $1,000, $2,000 bottles of wine from the Bordeaux region, you start seeing that retailers are making less and less profit off of those because it costs them so much to acquire the very best wines, they can't mark them up very much. And that's really interesting because it might be counterintuitive. If you go into a store and you buy a $1,000 bottle of wine, you might be gritting your teeth because you're thinking that retailer just totally skinned me on this. I paid a ton of money. But the retailer probably saw very little profit off of that. And that's what we're finding seems to be the case. Okay, so in conclusion, retailers experience lower margins for wines from the hotter, i.e. better years, especially for generally more expensive wines. Now, this is counterintuitive, and it suggests that someone up the supply chain is appropriating those benefits of the higher prices. We can't say for sure that it is necessarily entirely wholesalers because that supply chain becomes ambiguous and we can't tell you what price the wholesalers paid to the chateaus or what price the chateaus paid to the growers, etc. But we find this very interesting and a novel finding. With that, we'd love to field any questions.